Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to our study of the Gospel according to Luke. Today's chapter is Luke 22, and it deals primarily with events leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It's a rather long chapter, but an important one. We will be moving very quickly in our study because our purpose and aim and manner of study is to be sure that we read the text that is provided by Luke and by the Holy Spirit to us. So let's begin by looking at verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. The feast of unleavened bread lasted a week. The Passover was a one-day event. Technically, they may have been considered by some of the Jews as separate, but they took place adjacent to one another, and the people came for worship and often stayed an entire week. The sacrifice of Jesus was not done in a hidden way or during an inconspicuous time. Perhaps Israel's greatest crowds assembled for the Passover. It was the most ancient of their observances. The chief priests and the scribes were joined by the elders, according to Matthew, in an attempt to use their judicial system to execute Jesus. They feared the common sense of the common people, however, and so it was difficult for them to obtain permission to kill Christ on a cross. Remember, we are talking about the Passover time. This chart shows you the yearly observances that were established in the Pentateuch. The Passover and Pentecost, 50 days later, occurred in the spring. The Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur it is called now, and the Feast of Tabernacles occurred in the fall. Passover was observed as per the regulations in the law of Moses on the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish year. It was to be eaten as a meal at evening time. It was accompanied by this 7-day period called the Makkoth, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This feast commemorated the deliverance of Israel from the death of the firstborn and from the bondage in Egypt, according to Exodus chapter 12. Individuals were to bring the sheaf of the first fruits of their harvest. They were to bring a lamb for a burnt offering. They were to have offered a meal offering of flour and oil, and a drink offering of wine. They, of course, were to use unleavened bread, and there was to be no leavening in their homes. Congregationally, sacrifices were made each day at the tabernacle or at the temple in Jesus' day. This picture depicts some of the observance, and you can see the lamb and some of the other elements of the meal on the table before these worshipers at the Passover. it was Passover time when Jesus came into Jerusalem for this final time before his crucifixion. Well, back to our text. In verse 3, Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. It appears that Judas initiated this entire betrayal because of his greed. He wanted money. There is a background story revealed in John chapter 12 that helps us to understand Judas's motives. Jesus, along with Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha, went to Simon, a leper's house. Mary anointed Jesus' feet with an expensive ointment, and Judas thought that it was a waste. He wanted the money from it put in their common bag, which he kept, and we are told from which he took for himself. John says he was a thief, verse 6 of John 12. He was given then later 30 pieces of silver, probably shekels worth very little. He had no true love for Jesus. Later he would regret his betrayal, however, and he would try to give back the money. So verse 7 says, Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. So this is the day of the Passover. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. This assignment was really an all-day job for Peter and John. They would have to go and locate the room, and it would have been in a crowded city at that time when the Passover was being observed. They would have to obtain the elements of the meal. They would have to provide the sacrifice, the lamb. They would have to go and get the lamb and sacrifice it, seeing to the preparation. And then they would have to prepare the entire meal, roasting the lamb. So it would take the day to do what Jesus had assigned to Peter and John. So they said to him, verse 9, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready. It appears that this may have been already arranged. Rooms were scarce in the city of Jerusalem for as many people as were in the city at that time. You would expect that all these rooms would be taken up for the Passover meal. Some speculate it could have been the same room where the disciples met in Acts chapter 1 a little later. Tradition says it was the home of John Mark's mother. If that is so, then that leaves some credence, doesn't it, to the fact that this may have already been arranged by Jesus. At least Jesus, in his divine wisdom, knew about that room. So they went and found it, verse 13, just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Isn't it amazing how much Jesus knew about these events and how they would occur before he ever came to Jerusalem? It's amazing because it is divine. Well, verse 14 says, when the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And then he said to them, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. He was saying that he was wanting very much to have this last meal with his disciples. And when we read the book of John and read the instructions that he gave them and the lessons that he gave them on this night, we can see very well why he had such a desire to eat the Passover with them. He says, verse 16, for I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. The hour that was discussed in verse 14 was in the evening, after sunset. Mark tells us it was an evening meal. Jesus ate the literal Passover supper with them on that night. After he suffered, he would eat a spiritually fulfilled supper with them in his kingdom, as he goes on to explain in this passage. Verse 17 says, then he took the cup, and he gave thanks. And he said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. This was something that he was instituting. We call it the Lord's Supper for the kingdom, in continuity throughout its days. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Obviously, that was figurative. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. They would have so much more to remember concerning his body after they had seen it on the cross. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. The symbols, the bread and the fruit of the vine, the cup in the Lord's Supper, are significant. The bread remembering his body, and the cup looking at his covenant in his blood, offering forgiveness for mankind, which is shed for you. This supper's spiritual significance is further explained in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The supper is not the Passover, but a special meal using two elements of the Passover. It's a newly instituted supper for the kingdom. In verse 21, Jesus explains who the betrayer might be. At least he gives a warning concerning betrayal. He says, "But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table." One of the other gospel narratives talks about how that the betrayer is the one who dips in the sop or the gravy with Jesus. Jesus goes on in verse 22, saying, "And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined. But woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." It was God's appointment that Jesus be betrayed. That had been determined, but it was a terrible thing, and judgment would come for the one who did the betraying. Verse 23 says, "Then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing." It's difficult to know at what point in the evening Jesus spoke of a betrayer. It may have come after washing his disciples' feet. It could have come before instituting the Lord's Supper, following his statement that the one who dipped with him would betray him. Here he pronounces woe upon the betrayer. So it was at his own hand that this betrayer would be convicted. Well, as they move on, verse 24 says, "There was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table, or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves." Jesus really saw the greater as the servant. He showed that when he washed his disciples' feet. Again, this seems to have come surrounding Jesus' washing of feet. Verse 28 says, "But you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Jesus commends these apostles who had been with him and witnessed his trials. They had seen him enduring both. Peter speaks of his flawless handling of both in 1 Peter 2. There was no sin in Jesus. He did everything in the right way. The words here about Jesus' table are figurative, and obviously the thrones are also figurative. But he is saying that these disciples would enjoy the blessings of his kingdom and that they would have an important role in the kingdom in bringing people to him throughout the world. He would tell them to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. This having been said, there was a warning, however, and the warning was given directly to Simon Peter. The Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. Peter would be warned that he would deny the Lord. But he said in verse 33, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And then he said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny me 3 times that you know me. Well, Jesus said to them, to the apostles, when I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? Jesus had sent these apostles out before to test the waters in the Galilean cities, for example, and to announce that Jesus was coming to their cities. So they said nothing. They didn't lack anything. And then he said to them, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. They would be going out again, these apostles were. And this time they were to take some provisions, perhaps so that they would not be dependent on the people, but could carry on for themselves as they went into this important work without any hindrances. For I say to you, verse 37, that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it's enough. They didn't need a lot of swords. Jesus contrasts here the way he is sending them out this time with earlier missions that they and other disciples carried out for him. Well, that leads us to come back and think for just a moment about the timetable of this week that we call the Passion Week of Jesus. Traditionally, it is thought that Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem on Sunday. That's probably true. On Monday, he would have cleansed the temple and angered the leaders, so that on Tuesday they would come prepared to be in confrontation with him. On Wednesday, he gave some last teaching in the temple. On Thursday was the Passover meal and his time in Gethsemane when he was arrested by the Jewish leaders. On Friday were his trials, his crucifixion, and his burial. On Saturday he was in the tomb, and on Sunday again he was resurrected from the dead. That seems to fit the chronology of this period of time, this Passion Week, we call it. you may find some variances in teaching about those days, but at least this includes all the things that Jesus did in this period of time and provides a time for them. Well, after the meal, Jesus went out to Gethsemane. Gethsemane was a garden or a small park on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. It was out to the east of Jerusalem. Judas, no doubt, had a good idea where Jesus would be, because we are told in Luke 22 and John 18 that in the evenings Jesus went out to this park, to the Mount of Olives, and perhaps spent the night there. So let's go back to reading the text again. In verse 39, coming out after the Passover meal from the room where he was, he went to the Mount of Olives, as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. Notice this phrase, as he was accustomed. So apparently this was his nighttime place of abode, out in the open air. When he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed. He wanted some privacy, separate from his disciples, with his Father, and so he prays alone in the garden. And he said, "Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." There are in this passage of Scripture some unparalleled expressions of Jesus' emotions as a human being. Not often in the Scriptures are those expressed. Once in a while, for example, Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. He had emotions, great emotions, and we see them expressed on this occasion especially. The disciples needed prayer. They needed time, and Jesus says, "Pray that you enter not into temptation." The fact is, they would go to sleep. Jesus needed prayer. And as he prays, he asks God to remove this cup from me. That is, this cup of suffering and trial, determined for the next day. But he says, as we all ought to pray always, "Not my will, but your will be done." Have you ever felt that need? Have you ever really felt the need for prayer, as Jesus did on this occasion? Well, verse 43 says, "Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." Do you see why we said his emotions and expressions of emotions are given in this passage unlike any other in the New Testament? When he rose up from prayer and had come to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. And then he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. From early in the 2nd century, the question has been raised why Jesus would need an angel to strengthen him if he were God himself. The answer lies, I think, certainly, in the fact that he was also man. He was human while he was upon the earth. And as a human being, the stress of these situations that he was entering into now would be almost overwhelming. Luke, the physician, as a physician, perhaps, identifies the greatest stress possible. Whether Jesus was literally bleeding, hematidrosis, or whether he was figuratively like great drops of blood, is beside the point. The point is that there was such great stress upon Jesus at this time that he could have actually and physically bled from this trial. And probably he did, literally. The disciples needed rest from anxiety. The text says they were sleeping from sorrow. They must have been tired from the long day. They must have been confused and sorrowful at the things that Jesus had said to them back in that room after they had eaten the Passover meal. Well, while he was still speaking, verse 47, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Think of the irony that the sign was a kiss. A kiss is a symbol of love. Judas was betraying Jesus. It certainly was not an expression of love. Well, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? It appears that they were ready for a fight. And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. I suppose both sides were ready for a fight. The disciples and the Jewish leaders who had come out with swords and with armed men to take Jesus. The swordsman, in this case, on Jesus' side, was Peter. And the servant of the high priest is a man by the name of Malchus. We are told this in John chapter 18 at verse 10. Well, then Jesus said to the chief priests, the captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. Jesus was not a dangerous criminal. He had done nothing that would threaten life, well-being, or property of anyone, of any of the Jews, of any of those in the city for the Passover, and none of the people since his coming and beginning to preach. Nonetheless, it was their time to show their power over his physical person. So having arrested him, verse 54, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. Peter followed at a distance. Now this is the sad story of Peter. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while another saw him, and said, "You also are of them." Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, this is the third, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, just as the Lord had predicted. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter went out and wept bitterly. His conscience was deeply moved because he had done exactly what Jesus had warned him of doing. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" Blindfolded, of course, he would not know, except that he was divine and knew all things. And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council. The council, you will remember from several other occasions in our study, was the Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jews, and it is identified clearly here because it was the chief priests and scribes and elders who were saying these things to Jesus. In verse 67, they say, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter, the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." And then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" They couldn't believe he would make such an assertion, but he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." They would go on to crucify the Son of God. And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." We will pick up our study. Our next time, we will pick up our study at this point in the questionings of Jesus before his crucifixion. I hope that you'll be present for us as we study then. Have a blessed day.